Moi ben, pois abrimos un turno de preguntas, cuestións, o que se vos ocurra comentar, clarificacións tamén. Adiante. María José.
No, no.
Hola. Hola. Quería preguntar, porque actualmente se vese que están a emerxer nas diferentes culturas, como é a islámica, movimentos de carácter feminista. Entón, quería preguntar como podería conciliarse o movimento feminista, por exemplo, que surxe no Islam, con os movimentos occidentais, sen caer nunha base etnocentrista. É dicir, non crear un feminismo hegemónico. Esa é a miña pregunta.
I'll need
About the
translation.
conciliation between Muslim cultures and Occidental cultures, if they have their serious motives of disagreement, or is only misinterpretation of Islam. What's your opinion about this?
As in every culture, Islam, especially Islam, is a religion of huge numbers of people all over the world. I don't know the statistics if there are more Christian or Muslim over the world, but definitely it is there from North Africa to Indonesia and Malaysia. And I've been working closely with organizations like Women Living Under Muslim Laws. And they were trying to show how what is Islam is completely different in different so-called Muslim countries, or definitely states in which there is large or even majority of Muslim population. One of the results of the growing of fundamentalist religious movement has been the attempts to impose Muslim traditions that have grown in part of the Muslim world on other parts. This, for example, relates to the imposition of headscarves, or even female genital mutilation. I've been working with like the sister in Islam from Indonesia, who have been kind of fighting this kind of imposition of constructions of Islam, which have been a result of the huge amount of money that states like Saudi Arabia, and especially, but also other oil countries, on the one hand, and Iran on the other hand, but especially Saudi Arabia, of building mosques and madrasas, these religious schools, all over the Muslim world, and try and naturalize their Wahhabi construction of Islam as if this is the authentic kind of Islam. So this is not what Islam is. I remember when I visited Egypt in the early 80s, there was a huge debate on family planning there. So one side used the surah from the Quran, which said, you should not waste your seed, and therefore was against family planning. The other side used another surah, which said, you have to bring up all your children in a proper way, with equal love and with, conditions for their life. Right? So each of the sides used another surah of the Quran. Each of them said, I am authentically representing what Islam is. But of course, they didn't. They just used the very rich but full of internal contradiction. I said, resource of the Quran in order to promote particular political projects.
Fago un resumen, queres? Sí? Mira, o que dixo é que non estaba segura se había máis mulleres de religión islámica ou de outras religións, non? E que ela, por exemplo, traballou con asociacións de mulleres viviendo en países islámicos, non? E que existen diferencias en cada país en función de se a religión islámica é mayoritaria ou non. O que ela ve máis importante, por exemplo, donde está o meollo da cuestión, é que é la imposición dun tipo único, la naturalización dun tipo de islam que se considera, que pode considerarse máis auténtico. Por exemplo, falaba de Indonesia, a inversión millonaria de países como Arabia Saudí, en madrasa, en posición de distintos tipos de velo, etc. Esa naturalización dunha versión del Islam, la naturalización de este tipo de práctica. Porque esa versión no es la única versión, dice que esto no es lo único que es el Islam. ¿Vale?
Yeah, can I just, one addition, this is not just true about Islam, of course. Similar things happen in all major religions, and I've been part of AWID, which is the largest international women's organization, Association for Women, Human Rights and Development, who have come together to work against religious fundamentalism in all religions. So both of those who are within religions and also atheists and women who do not see themselves as belonging to particular religions, which in the countries where they grew up. And one of the most successful fights against this kind of naturalization, for example, in Latin America, has been a series of cartoons that have been presented in major television channels, which mock some of the very sexist kind of statement of Catholic priests about the place of women. So this is not just about Islam. I think it's very important that we see that the rise of autochthony, the rise of fundamentalism, whether religious or ethnic, nationalist, and racial, is going all over the globe for quite similar reasons, but in very different local and temporal constructions.
Haciendo un resumen así moi a grosso modo, dice que isto non é só aplicable á religión islámica, senón que ao fundamentalismo e á naturalización de distintas prácticas como unha única versión da religión tamén se aplica a outros lugares.
Sí. Thank you very much for your interesting and stimulating lecture. I agree with you, and some questions come to mind about important contribution to debates about situated intersectionality. Is a hard word.
Intersectionality,
yes. I agree with you, and my question, first question, at this moment, I would like to know that what you think about the danger of political desactivation of intersectionality in a neoliberal context, as some feminist theorists have discussed. And in relation to this, I like to necessarily or not means transversal politics or
Means what?
transversal politics,
Transversal politics. Right.
or a coalition politics.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. First of all, I think that the debate about depoliticization of feminist politics in general and intersectionality in particular is a very important one and relates to the debates that I brought at the beginning of my speech, that some feminists, especially Black feminists, have argued that if we use intersectionality as a general mode of analysis, it becomes depoliticized. For me, this is not true because although I do believe that we have to fight this tendency for depoliticization of feminism and also using particular version of intersectionality, which I see as becoming part of kind of fragmented identity politics. I remember in The Guardian, the major newspaper in Britain, there was this article that said, "I'm too white to be intersectional," which of course was a very essentialist identity politics interpretation of intersectionality. Feminism have become split the last 20 years in several ways. On the one hand, to academia, which became completely theoretical and not nurtured or linked to concrete social and political struggle. On the other hand, to professionalization of NGOs that become, because of the need for always raising funds and so on, being more and more kind of influenced and bought by global neoliberal kind of foundations and so on. And thirdly, all these popular grassroots social movements that were the whole heart and soul of feminism when it started, like other social movements, people become too busy, too poor, and too disheartened because of the way that it became either professional, especially legal professional, or academic to relate in the everyday life. And I agree with you. But I don't think situated intersectionality falls into this trap. First of all, I described one of our political struggles within academia to adopt intersectionality rather than just class as a way of analyzing, or to separate issues from gender and race and class, which is very often the way that these things are being taught in the academia rather than in a mutually constituted way. So even within the academia and the new liberalization of the academia itself, there is a space for a lot of political movement. Secondly, I think situated intersectionality, because it insists of applying the analysis to everybody, avoids the trap, as I said, of exceptionalism and contributing to the surveillance of those who have no power and are marginalized. We live in a surveillance society in which ethnic, racialized minorities and women and the powerless are all the time under surveillance. If we apply intersectionality analysis only to them, then we let go of those we really have to analyze and observe in terms of their power positioning, in terms of their accessibility of resources, the way, for example, I've been working in recent years on issues of everyday bordering, the way that those who have money can cross borders and those who do not get stuck, and how it affects the general power positions. How we cannot talk about, we talk about migrants and then we talk about expats in the development countries. Should we apply intersectional analysis only on women of migrants or irregular migrants in the West, rather than also to the expats who are supposedly experts or lifestyle migrant or the frequent flyer class, as Craig Calhoun has been calling them. I think this is very dangerous. So inadvertently, I think those who preach to define politics only in terms of Black women politics are weakening the general cause of emancipatory politics and the close relationship which I perceive and have been practicing throughout my life between political activism and theoretical and methodological analysis. I'm not sure if you agree, but that's what I think about this issue.
Va a ser un poco difícil resumir todo esto, pero o que mayormente María José preguntou, sí, era pola despolitización, o peligro, corríxeme se me equivoco.
Sí, bueno, a pregunta, para que se entenda mellor a resposta que facía, que hai unha discusión, un debate en parte da teoría feminista, que esta concepción da interseccionalidade, como supón o ben por adición, todo un conxunto de eixes de opresión, consideran que en un contexto como neoliberal eso supón unha desactivación política. Entón, eu lle preguntaba se, según ela, o concepto de interseccionalidade levaría consigo ese perigo de desactivación política, non? E vinculado con eso, para que nos pudera tamén falar algo de un concepto que ela manexa e que propón nos seus textos, nos seus escritos, que é o da política transversal ou política de coalición, posto que ao haber distintos eixes de opresión, habería que facer unha política de coalición.
Sí, pois, eso, perdíme un pouco, e tamén a idea xeral que creo que veu a dicir é que non cree que isto sea despolitizante por si mesmo, senón que habría que ter en conta distintos feitos que están sucedendo, por exemplo, os movimentos sociais dende as bases, que tamén, bueno, dibuja o suxeito político, se non me equivoco do que quere dicir, tamén o papel das ONGs e a súa necesidade de conseguir fondos, etc. Tamén perdeme un pouco, entón, o que tamén referiu é, por exemplo, ao feito da sociedade da vigilancia que focaliza nos migrantes, que, por exemplo, isto creo que foi un exemplo que puso, é que se a existencia da fronteira a teoría da fronteira só aplica ás persoas pobres, non? E, por exemplo, se podería aplicarse a mesma teoría ás persoas, bueno, expatriados, referiuse se a mesma teoría podería aplicarse a... Con carta ou se non, efectivamente. Entón, bueno.
Eso lo añadiría, que é parte de unha cuestión que é o problema do neoliberalismo na academia e o feminismo académico trata eso, que creo que vai máis alado que nos, bueno, requeriría máis tempo, non? Creo que hai unha parte que me pareceu interesante da resposta, que é esa vinculación da análise teórica ca activismo político. Que creo que eso reforza a posición que leva e que, polo tanto, iría contra a tese de que a interseccionalidade situada, como se di, que desactiva políticamente, sino todo o contrario.
Despolitizador.
Despolitizador. Creo que así, creo que resumo.
Sí, sí. Bien. Pues pasa a Roy allí atrás y luego allí.
Hola, boa tarde. Bueno, a pregunta que vou facer é sobre o concepto mesmo de cultura e por que me dá a impresión de que a cuestión do sistema económico quedou fora da análise da profesora, ¿no? Good evening, and first of all, thank you for a brilliant presentation. My question will be about the very meaning of culture and how I feel the economic system has been left out of the analysis. To put an example, in the Western world, for instance, and particularly amongst the younger generations, what is left of other culture than the capitalist, industrial or financial capitalist culture? I mean, everyone watches the same television channels, which are mostly American channels in the internet. Everyone reads the same books, if they read any. And I feel this particular Western culture is the result of a particular economic system. So I wanted to know how intersectionality feels about this question, and how culture is, in the end, a reflection of the economic structure in Marxian terms. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
I hope I made myself understandable.
Okay. Thank you very much for this question. This is the reason why I insisted that we cannot analyze the meaning of culture without the political, economical context in which it operates. And of course, under neoliberal globalization, it seems at the beginning that there is going to be also globalization of culture, and some of the commodification of particular products of culture, like what you said, the TV channels and books and films and so on, to a great extent have become much more global, or the exposure have been much global than before. But as many, like the Peterson, Assad and others insisted, you cannot see it as only what was seen as globalization, as if the whole local has become standardized and every local operates as kind of a particular instance of the global. Although global cities like New York, London, Paris, in some ways do operate, the emphasis should be on translation rather than just spreading. You said it was difficult even to say in Spanish the word intersectionality. During lunch, I was telling that I was invited to Israel, my so-called homeland and my mother tongue, to speak about intersectionality, and I don't know how to say the word in Hebrew. So it doesn't exist. So, so there is a lot which is lost in translation, although, and others which is transmitted, but with some different contested meaning from this kind of situated analysis. But of course, the way cultures have been commodified, not just in terms of television channel, also in terms of restaurants. What is a food? This is Chinese food. This is, you know, Spanish food. This is French food, and so on. Very often has become particular interpretations and standardization for export rather than the enriched, heterogeneous, and much more colorful and affected by locality, class, and so on, even in the terms of food. So there is no doubt that there is an impulse to commodify and to flatten cultures and to make them, you know, remember the Coca-Cola advertisements and so on, which symbolize what you're trying to talk about. But we cannot collude with this kind of interpretation of culture, which even were operative in some of government policies, multiculturalist policies, which very often in which cultures were reduced to called saris, way of clothes, or samosas, particular kind of food, and some kind of holiday as representing religions and so on. This is a very, in my paper, I mentioned guns, which very much talk about symbolic identities. And when I talk about the preservation and endurance of culture, how very often the meaning completely changes and becomes signifier of difference or just signifier of exotic, cosmopolitan way of life, and so on. But if we look at meaning of culture from this multifaceted, multi-level, situated analysis, if we look at culture as shifting and contested way of life, of practices and beliefs and so on, then of course it is not just about the products of what used to be high culture and now is popular culture. Everybody is following the same football games everywhere in the television, but also the way that everyday life has been to some extent standardized, but also retain very rich difference. So I would absolutely endorse what you said, that we cannot analyze culture divorced from the political economy context, both of the individuals, the groupings, and the globe as a whole. But at the same time, I would not reduce understanding culture to these commodified forms of it, products of it.
A ver, a principal pregunta do público é que se o sistema económico queda fora un pouco fora da análise da proposta que trae NIRA e YUVAL-DAVIS. Ela está de acordo en que non pode deixar fora do análise da cultura a economía ou a análise económico. Por exemplo, puso distinto exemplo no que o neoliberalismo, a globalización da cultura é un feito. Tamén, pero simplemente tampouco quería ver a globalización como unha imposición frente ao local, senón que tamén trouxo o concepto de globalización como tamén localmente se adapta á globalización, non? E contéstase, non? Entón, falou tamén da mercantilización da cultura, da comida, da estandarización deste tipo de prácticas culturais, non? E non o pone en duda, pero se analizamos, se propón un análisis multisituado no que la propón, que tamén poden ser ver como esta globalización, esta neoliberalización está sendo contestada e produce distintos tipos de resistencia, non? Ao nivel da vida cotidiana. A súa análise final é que a cultura, por suposto, a análise da cultura non pode verse divorciada do análise económico, pero tampouco o análise económico ten que deixar de lado o análise cultural.
Hola, ¿qué tal? Bueno, yo voy a preguntar cómo podemos interpretar la crisis de los refugiados, pero en particular me interesaba el caso de Francia, que es el modelo de asimilación, y me gustaría hacerle esa pregunta. Well, thank you very much for your presentation. I would like to ask you, from your point of view, how we can interpret what's happening in France and the next elections, and Brexit, of course, you came from England. This is a consequence of something deep, but deep in general, what's happening in the world. All these movements in nationalism and all this movement of assimilation against the immigrants, and how can we fight it, and how shall we do? Thank you very much.
Yeah. Thank you. And of course, you forgot to mention Donald Trump. I was in the United States last week. Yeah. Of course, exactly. So I'm sure you have not forgotten. I talked, this is what I said, it's another kind of paper, when I talked about the double global crisis, systemic crisis of governability and governmentality. And I said, we cannot see the rise of autochtonic populism. Autochtonic politics, I don't know if it is used in Spanish, it is, when I wrote my book, The Politics of Belonging, I talked about indigenousness, and then the reader of the first draft of the book got very indignant because she was from Canada and she was very active in indigenous people's rights, which of course I would support. So she asked me not to collapse the two things together. So then I saw the book by Peter Geshier, which compare Africa and the Netherlands and talked about autochtonic belonging. So in the UN, the indigenous Declaration of Indigenous People, when they translate it to French, it's called autochtone. But in France, in the Netherlands, the autochtonic is not necessarily the indigenous in terms of the those who were deprived and excluded and exploited and exterminated by settler colonial state, but it's those who from the Greek word of those who belong to the soil. So it is politics of belonging, which just divide those who belong and those who do not belong. So as Geshier, he sees it as the turning of the global into the local. And he rightly points out that it is a much emptier notion than that, for example, of ethnicity. Because ethnicity, with all its looseness, relate to some kind of genealogy of past generation and future and so on. Autochtony in terms of belong, not belong, for example, in Britain, there was the kind of the old-fashioned extreme right nationalist movement, like the British National Party, which, by the way, tried to get a status of the UN as the indigenous people of Britain. But they were very much so themselves as, let's say, the English, not the general kind of British white supremacy English from the, you know, doomsday forever being there. The more recent kind of movement, the Defense League and so on, had not only Irish people in them, they had Afro-Caribbean people in them, they had Jewish people, let alone Irish, and gay people in them, and so on. And similarly in the Netherlands, and also that's the difference between Marie Le Pen and her father. The difference is that it is not a question of origin, it's a question of belonging. This is why there's so much kind of assimilation. And it can be different scales, like in my part of London. When the Afro-Caribbeans arrived, the white working class, you know, completely rejected them as not belonging and gave all these racist stereotypes them and so on. 20 years later, the Turks and Kurds appear. And the Afro-Caribbeans, I remember I had students who were African, and I was absolutely shocked that as long as it was racism against blacks or the racism of the police and so on, they were right on. The minute you talked about refugees and Kurds and Turks, the same racist stereotypes appeared in the language because it was their place, they belonged. So it can be from the scale of a gang in a particular housing estate to the particular kind of white race of the world or the Muslim Ummah or whatever. What is common to all of them is that it divides the world into us and them in a completely fixed, essentialized and hierarchical way that we belong and they do not belong. They do not belong, therefore they are not entitled to be here, or even if they are here, they are not entitled. For example, Le Pen is appearing as a defender of the welfare state, but the welfare state only to those who belong to the French nation. But some of these who belong can be North African, who have been assimilated and have been there. So the dividing line is not racial or ethnic, but those who belong and those who do not belong. And of course, as I explained, this is not a culturalist phenomena. This is a phenomena which people were looking for a way of how it appears also in Brexit and in Donald Trump, and that we can take our lives, our nation, our borders back into control. People feel that they lose control. And of course they lose control because the multinationals are controlling. But, and even in terms of governments, it's in Britain now, there's been a legal struggle, and then now in the House of Lords, of the right of the parliament to say whether or not, and what kind of agreements of Brexit the British people are entitled to, because the government is only negotiating it. I mean, and in the case of the United States, it's not only that the businessmen are controlling the government, the businessmen entered government. I mean, they are not trusting anybody anyway already. So we'll see how long this will take. So this is a phenomena which has cultural and political expression, but underneath it, it's a systemic crisis of governability of governmentality under global neoliberalism, which have become much stronger, of course, since the crisis of 2008 and the bailing of banks, because then it became clear to government as well as to everybody else that as a result of neoliberalization, there is no clear difference anymore between the public and the private sphere. And they cannot survive without bailing out, you know, the bank and the interest of the multinational, while they can survive with so-called austerity policies and getting, like in Greece, kind of selling the citizens for debts for generations. So that's how I would relate to it, yeah.
My question was, how can we fight it?
Well, first of all, we fight it by understanding it. If we see it only in terms of culturalist development or only as racist development, we cannot understand it. There were many people, for example, of Afro-Caribbean origin in Britain that voted for Brexit because they believed that if Britain goes back to the boundaries of the mother country of the British Empire, they might have more control and rights because so many of the East European, by the way, many of them are genuinely racist against blacks, but also they feel are taking their places and all this kind of place. So if we analyze it and we understand what the situation, then we can, the fight should be not in the way that in Britain, Labour under Corbyn tried to develop a so-called left populism against this right populism, which is what I call autochtonic policy. Because populism is emphasizing one element in democracy. Democracy, I think, is basically composed by two quite contradictory elements that have tension between them. One is the majority rule. The other one is rights for everyone, including the marginalized and racialized minorities and women and so on. Michael Mann called it the dark side of democracy, this push towards homogenization and exclusion, and he took as his case study what happened in former Yugoslavia, the kind of this exclusionary. So if we go to populism, this is just the first one, the dark one of majority rule. In Brexit, 52% voted for Brexit, 48% voted against. But according to this populism, including Corbyn, the left populism, we voted for Brexit. Then that's the only thing that counts. Because suddenly only the majority counts, even if it's a majority only of 4%, rather than making sure that everybody has right, everybody has voice, and so on. So we have to fight by a counter-narrative which will not be also populist, but which will emphasize this dialogical epistemology of intersectional view of society. It's more complex, and therefore maybe it's more difficult to mobilize. It doesn't give itself to easy slogans on posters, but I believe that this is the only way to keep this counter-narrative, to invest power, people, resources in keeping this counter-narrative. Because if we try to imitate the right by inventing left populism, I think we're lost. I don't know if it answered you.
It's quite clear.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bueno, pues él ha referido a doble crisis de gobernabilidad e gobernamentalidad. Tamén, a ver se me acordo de todo, falou da diferencia entre o que ela chama autoctonidade, por así decirlo, ¿no? Ela decía que falaba antes de indigenidade, pode ser así? Pero, bueno, tivo distintas, digamos, discusión con colegas, prefería centrarse no concepto de pertenencia e autoctonidade, ¿no? Porque esa idea se refiere a aquelas personas que pertenecen a un lugar, ¿no? Entonces, ela fala da pertenencia a un lugar como o que está, a ver, que me perdo la idea, o que está agora mesmo, ¿no? Está sendo posto sobre a mesa, ¿no? Nos distintos movimentos o que preguntaba a persoa do público, ¿no? Entonces, falaba de que o movimento, por exemplo, en Francia, ten que ver, o sea, agrupa persoas con distintas características, ¿no? Pero o que ten en común non é o seu orixe, senón o sentido de pertenencia, ¿no? a un determinado lugar. É a defensa desa pertenencia al lugar. Por ejemplo, tenía una afrocaribeña que también tenía un discurso similar en Inglaterra, perdón, me pasa en castellano, un discurso similar sobre la pertenencia, ¿no? O que defendía non era a orixe, senón a pertenencia a ese lugar, ¿no? Entón, ela fala dunha división do mundo entre entre un nosotros que pertenecemos a un lugar e os que non pertenecen a este lugar. Bueno, a liña de división é, entón, a pertenencia ou non. Isto non é algo cultural, o que apela neste movimento, senón ao sentido da pérdida do control desta pertenencia, non? Esta sería unha reacción ante este sentido de pérdida do control. Aunque o control tamén falaba que o tengan multinacionais, non? Entón, isto ten que ver coa crise de gobernabilidade. Entón, volví a apelala para preguntarle pola como podemos loitar digamos, contra a emerxencia deste movimento. Entón, ela respondeu que só podemos loitar na medida en que os entendamos, non? En que o analicemos, entendamos como está funcionando. Por exemplo, proponía que esta loita non ten que ser desde un populismo de izquierda, porque, por exemplo, este populismo vendría a enfatizar un único elemento do que se compón a democracia. Decía que os dos elementos da democracia é que a maioría manda, e o segundo elemento da democracia, que caracteriza a democracia, é que os dereitos son de toda a xente, non? Que tamén para a xente marginalizada. Entón, este populismo vendría a rescatar solo a primeira característica da democracia, que a maioría manda. Por exemplo, poñía o Brexit, que o principal digamos, aglutinante do Brexit é que por fin todos puderon votar algo, non? Que esa maioría estaba mandando. Entón, desde a súa aportación, a súa chega final é que non só a loita non só ten que vir dende un populismo de esquerda, senón coa complexidade que aporta a epistemoloxía, non sei ben como epistemoloxía dialóxica, non? Ou un diálogo epistemológico, non sei como ponerle, traducir.
En España diríamos democracia deliberativa e participativa, ¿no? Bueno, como complemento.
Sí.
Hai unha cuestión máis ali pendente. Entón son dúas. Brevemente, por favor, porque estamos...
Good evening. I just wanted to know your opinion about this swimming scarf head that Nike recently presented. I just wanted to know if you think a swimming hijab is good in terms of culture and feminism.
Sorry,
The headscarf.
The headscarf.
Yeah.
So, what's my opinion about it?
Hijab, no.
Headscarf
is...
yeah.
But
Are you talking about the headscarf or the
to
veil?
swim?
Burka.
Burka. Yeah. I mean, first of all, as I kind of talked about before, I think that it is problematic just to focus on particular cultural customs or practices as symbolizing and homogenizing a whole kind of... The burqa, if you talk about burqa rather than hijab, is popular in Afghanistan. It's not popular in other parts of the Muslim world at all. So are you asking me only the burqa in Afghanistan, or are you asking me about the burqa as symbol of the status of Muslim women the world over? I think if you ask me the second rather than the first, then I think it's a very problematic way of asking it, because it is it's kind of looking at one particular practice and is signifying the status of billions of women. So Can you clarify your question before I answer?
Yeah, about that. I'm talking about a headscarf, only a headscarf, like a swimming pool, you know.
Oh, that's not burqa.
No,
That's
no, but
headscarf, yeah.
everybody
hijab.
misunderstood me.
The name is
Everybody.
Yeah,
hijab.
hijab, yeah. I mean, it's a certain kind of...
Estás preguntando por el burkini.
No, 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 no.
El hijab, sí.
Hijab.
Yeah.
A ver, lo voy a decir en español y luego lo repito en inglés. En español es que la marca Nike sacó un gorro que es como un hijab para nadar, para las mujeres árabes, para los Juegos Olímpicos y demás. Entonces no me estoy refiriendo al burka, lo que pasa es que todo el mundo me entendió mal o algo, pero no, es solo un gorro que es para eso.
¿Cuál es la pregunta exactamente?
La pregunta es si eso, hay mucha controversia en Internet porque hay gente que piensa que está bien porque respeta la cultura de las personas que lo utilizan y otras personas que piensan que eso va en contra del feminismo. Entonces, esa es mi pregunta.
The gender bias of the
Yeah,
hijab,
yeah.
not only burqa, but
Yeah,
also
I
the-
think that if I understood your question right, you know, at certain beaches, they allow only the bottom part of bikini. At other beaches, they allow only 2 parts of bikini. In other beaches, they allow only full swimming. In the Victoria time, they had these very kind of structures that women had to hide in order to go to swim in the sea. We have to differentiate between cultural practice in particular time and place and the power relations that they kind of symbolize. And the power relations that headscarf used in swimming pool or in gym and so on come from 2 very contradictory origins in today politics. And I think we have to be very sensitive. This is why, again, situated intersectional dialogical epistemology is very important, because part of it comes from fear of not conforming in the community. Very often there is kind of bullying by teenage gangs of boys towards teenage kind of girls, the construction of women as symbolic border guards of cultures and communities and honor and so on. The other part of the other source of it is Muslim women identity politics, which sees in wearing headscarf resistance to the racism of the hegemonic majority, and say, I'm not ashamed of being of Muslim origin or of Muslim faith, and you know, you can go to hell. This is completely contradictory political motivation to wearing the same thing. When I see a woman wearing a headscarf, I never know what is the origin of this. This is different from, you know, very young girls, because very young girls, I mean, there was a case which even went to the Supreme Court in which actually they quoted our book about refusing holy orders about women fundamentalism in Britain, because it was a school in which there were a lot of Muslim children, and as a result of consultation between the teachers and the headmaster and the parents, they agreed on a version of the school uniform for Muslim children. This particular girl, her brothers were members of a particular fundamentalist Muslim movement, and they insisted that she would come not in what was the agreed Muslim version, which were complied with the modesty version of the Muslim parent in that school, but with, you know, a dress till the floor and the cover to the head and all this kind of thing. And the school headmaster sent her home because he said, you do not comply with a school uniform. And it went until the Supreme Court. And they, and rightly in my opinion, agreed that a child in this age cannot be considered to be a full adult with a full political agency, especially as it was not clear if it was her wish or her brother's wish, and so on. And her family have to comply with the same regulation of other parents in the school. They can always send her to another school if she doesn't agree, without uniform, if she doesn't agree. So this was, so for me, what age, what are the particular circumstances, very much kind of define how I will think about it. But headscarf in itself is an empty signifier unless you know what was the situated case of those who decided to wear it. So I would always ask them before I will make up my mind. Yeah.
O que dixo, por exemplo, é que existen distintos exemplos de praia nos que se permite a parte de abaixo ou a de arriba, un traxe de baño completo, etc. Ela aboga por localizar, analizar estas prácticas culturales no seu contexto, lugar e tempo, non? Porque, por exemplo, ela non ten problema en aceptar por exemplo, o uso do velo por unha muller que teña medo a non encaixar nunha comunidade, por exemplo, é que o use como forma de resistencia á asimilación nun determinado lugar, non? Pero a primeira vista ou non unha primeira aproximación non pode dicirte exactamente se esa muller o usa como modo de resistencia ou como modo tamén, unha cosa que me gustoume moito, é como que as mulleres son a guardiana simbólica da fronteira dunha determinada grupo cultural, non? Entón, por exemplo, puso exemplo dunha nena pequena no que seu pai era dunha rama máis fundamentalista do Islam, non? E que foi a unha escola, foi á Corte Suprema porque quería levarla a unha escola usando esta forma de vestir. Entón, ela di que a nena non ten unha esencia política como unha adulta, non? Non pode, son os adultos que están exercendo a súa esencia a través de esa nena, entón que os padres poderían haberla noutra escola, etc. Pero, en definitiva, en conclusión, o que ela di é que o velo, o hijab, en sí mesmo é un significante vacío, entón non pode dar unha resposta así sin contextualizarlo novamente, pois eso, dunha forma situada, un análisis interseccional, sen saber exactamente a que se refire.
Moi ben, o sinto, pero estamos xa fora de tempo. Únicamente unha pregunta que estaba aquí, porque estamos xa 10 minutos pasados ahora. Hai unha cuestión, non podo dar máis palabras.
Nada, graciñas. Nada, unha cuestión breve. Cal é a diferencia que ela ve entre a teoría decolonial e o que é a teoría da interseccionalidade, non? What is the difference between the colonial theory and intersectionality theory? For you, the colonial theory developed by Nelson Maldonado Torres, for example, Walter Mignolo, what are the differences for you between these two theories or approach?
talk about post-colonial or colonial? Decolonial. Well, I see decolonial theory probably as a particular case of intersectional gaze, because one of the things which I find problematic politically as well as theoretically in post-colonial or decolonial studies, that again, they retain the dichotomy between the colonial and the non-colonial. And I think that in addition to this very important difference, there is this very important heterogeneity within each social and political context and historical context. But what is the most important thing which are in common is that decolonial as well as intersectional try to decenter the colonial, the Western, the powerful as a naturalized truth and problematize it. I just think that situated intersectionality does it in a much more sophisticated way than the decolonial.
Bueno, el haber a decolonialidade como unha parte do que propón a teoría interseccional, non? En definitiva, que a decolonialidade tamén o que propón é descentralizar o análise, non? É de naturalizar a verdade occidental como a única forma do análise.
Moi ben, pois moitísimas grazas pola vosa presenza, moitísimas grazas, NIRA.
Thank you for very provoking and interesting question and discussion.
Thank you. Okay.